Hello and welcome to Budget with Business Standard. I'm Nivedita Mukherjee. This episode is about understanding the budget. Our top story today has answers to the fiscal math jigsaw puzzle. Then there's a compelling interview looking at the budget up close and personal. And we have lots more. Let's begin with fiscal math, which really is the foundation of the union budget. What do numbers such as fiscal deficit imply for the economy? And what does the fiscal deficit target mean for revenue and growth? Watch this report to know all about the most important aspect of the budget.
The fiscal deficit target is perhaps the most important number in any budget-making exercise. In simple terms, fiscal deficit is the difference between the expenditure and revenues of a government when the former is higher. For the fiscal year 2022-23, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman has targeted a fiscal deficit of Rs 16.61 trillion or 6.4% of the nominal gross domestic product. The assumption is that nominal GDP would grow by 11.1% next year. The gross tax revenue for FY23 is seen at around 9.6% on back of the 11.1% GDP growth assumption. Analysts say that this is a rather conservative target which could be easily met, especially given that as per the current year's revised estimate, nominal GDP for FY22 is around 18% and gross tax revenue growth is seen at around 24%. However, Revenue Secretary Tarun Bajaj told Business Standard that if one removes the excise duty component, which is expected to be much lower next year, the revenue growth rate for FY23 is around 14.5% and revenue buoyancy is expected to be around 1.25. Non-tax revenues for FY23 have been pegged at Rs 2.69 trillion compared with FY22 revised estimate of Rs 3.14 trillion and budget estimate of Rs 2.43 trillion. A big surprise has been the budget estimate for divestment next year, which is just Rs 65,000 crore. The government has many pending privatization plans it would want to push next year, including Bharat Petroleum, Container Corporation, Shipping Corp, Pawan Hans and others. The total FY23 budget size is pegged at Rs 39.4 trillion, a 4.5% increase over the FY22 revised estimate of Rs 37.7 trillion. Of this, the revenue expenditure for FY23 has been budgeted at Rs 31.9 trillion, almost the same as the revised estimate for FY22. The big jump comes in capital expenditure. The CapEx budget estimate for FY23 is Rs 7.5 trillion, a 24.6% increase over the FY22 revised estimate of Rs 6.02 trillion. The FY22 CapEx budget estimate was Rs 5.54 trillion. However, the CapEx target for next year also includes Rs 1 trillion to be given to states as a 50-year interest-free loan for their capital expenditure needs. There has been a cut in allocation for NREGA and healthcare in the coming year. As per the government, the former is because it is a demand-driven scheme and the latter because the vaccination budget is much less this year. Finance Secretary T.V. Somanathan told Business Standard that if the need arises, the centre would provide more funds later in the year for any scheme or requirement. For the revised estimates of FY22, fiscal deficit is seen at 6.9% of GDP compared with the budget estimate of 6.8%. However, top officials, including the Finance Minister, have admitted that the centre has been very conservative in terms of what it expects from the Life Insurance Corporation initial public offering. If the IPO is a success, then the centre could very well meet its original fiscal deficit target for the current year.
Connected to the fiscal calculation is the government's plan on mega spend. Higher capital expenditure on road and infrastructure has been the defining theme of this budget. But here's a report explaining the twist in the public investment strategy.
In her fourth budget for the Narendra Modi government, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman increased capital expenditure for FY23 by a whopping 35.4% to 7.5 trillion rupees over the previous year's budget estimate. The idea was to continue public investment-led recovery of the pandemic-battered economy. However, the government seems to have realized the constraints of capex spending by central government ministries. And that's why it allocated 1 trillion rupees out of the 7.5 trillion rupees capex allocation to states through 50-year interest-free loans over and above the normal borrowings allowed to the states. While this may be a smart move to aid states in catalyzing their public infrastructure activities, it shows that the capacity of central government ministries to implement large infra projects is limited despite the government's push through the National Infrastructure Pipeline and Gati Shakti Master Plan. To augment higher capacity, the budget proposed to upgrade skills of central ministries, state governments, and their infra agencies with technical support from the Capacity Building Commission. This year's budget lays a lot of emphasis on public-private partnerships for infra projects. To encourage innovative financing, the government will now incentivize important sunrise sectors like climate action, deep tech, pharma, and agri-tech through thematic funds for blended finance, where the government's share will be limited to 20% and the funds will be managed by private fund managers. The government will also award contracts for implementation of multi-modal logistics parks at 4 locations through the PPP mode in FY23. To incentivize private capital, budget also proposes measures to enhance financial viability of PPP projects by promising to adopt global best practices, innovative ways of financing, and balanced risk allocation.
The capital expenditure push is a way to put the pandemic-hit economy back on track. But our guest, P. Chidambaram, former finance minister and Congress leader, doesn't agree. Listen in to a conversation between Mr. Chidambaram and Individual Dhasmana on a range of topics.
My first question to you, Mr. Chidambaram, is that the budget's focus is on capex-led economic recovery. What is your take on this strategy, given that the economy is struggling to come out of the COVID-induced slowdown?
Our problem is not lack of capital. Our problem is lack of jobs. In India, unemployment is at a very high level. What we need is job-creating investments, not capital-intensive investments. We have abundant capital. We don't have jobs. Therefore, I protest, I reject an approach which is based on capital-intensive investment.
You have criticized the budget on fiscal prudence too, but had the budget addressed so many concerns of the economy that you have underlined, had that not widened the fiscal deficit?
No, I'm not unhappy that they did not compress the fiscal deficit too much. This is a time when there must be fiscal liberalization. So I'm not unhappy about that. Please read my statement. I pointed out that you are reiterating that you will reach the 4% fiscal deficit target in 2025-26. If that is your goal, this compression for next year is not sufficient. You will have to still compress 2.5% in the remaining 2 years. How are you going to do that? Therefore, if that goal is correct, this compression is insufficient, is what I pointed out.
You also said that huge market borrowings by the government will crowd out private investment. But the government believes that this will crowd in private sector investment. What's your take?
This is unusual economic theory. So far, I've heard every governor, every finance minister says, if the government borrows too much from the market, it will crowd out private borrowing because the private sector will not have enough money to borrow in the market. And even if money is available, the interest rate will be high. This is what we have heard for the last 20 years. Today, you turn it around on its head and say If government borrows more, it will crowd in private investment. This is illogical. Either what you said for 20 years is wrong, or what you say now is wrong. I think what you say now is wrong.
You also said that there is not a single word about raising more resources from the rich or super rich. 142 persons whose wealth you said has increased from 23 lakh crore to around 53 lakh crore. So had this been resorted to, a tax on super rich or some kind of more surcharge, don't you think that it would have scared wealth creators?
No, I'm not against wealth creation. Please understand, I support creation of wealth. I even support accumulation of wealth, because new wealth is new capital is new investment. Creation of wealth and accumulation of wealth helps in risk-taking, innovation, R&D, charity, and many other uses. The point is, at what point should wealth accumulation stop? Put some ceiling, some cap somewhere. What is this 53 lakh crore wealth for 142 people? What does it mean? It means something like 3 lakh crore rupees is the average wealth of these 142 people. All I'm saying is, if there are so many wealthy people, wealthy means beyond your imagination, my imagination, you should tap into that wealth.
You described the budget as a capitalist budget. Why such a sudden angst against capitalism?
I made it very clear. I have no angst against capitalism. I believe that regulated capitalism is a driver of a competitive economy, and a competitive economy grows faster, creates more wealth, and can share more wealth among the people. I have nothing against capitalism. But at the same time, there must be welfare. Now tell me, there is not a word about cash assistance to the very poor. Not a word about 4.6 crore people who've been pushed into extreme poverty. Not a word for those who lost jobs. Not a word about the 60 lakh MSMEs which have been shut down. Not a word of comfort, not a gesture to the 84% of households which have lost income. Not a word about the learning loss of our school-going children in the last 2 years, especially in rural areas and in government schools. Not a word of intervention in malnutrition, stunting, and wasting. Now, if you don't have a word to say about these poor, deprived, suffering people, yet you paint this as a growth-oriented budget, for whose growth is this budget? Therefore, I called it a capitalist budget. It is written and prepared and written and delivered only from the capitalist point of view.
What would you have done in the budget in a few steps had you been the finance minister this time around too?
A finance minister under Mr. Narendra Modi has nothing to do. The finance minister is to only read a speech drafted in the PMO. So you must tell me, finance minister under which prime minister?
Say under Manmohan Singh.
A finance minister under Dr. Manmohan Singh would, in 22-23, with the guidance of Dr. Manmohan Singh, crafted a budget that emphasizes the first W, work. How do you create jobs? The second W, welfare. How do you reach out and make gestures or comfort people who have suffered in the last 2 years? And the third W, wealth. How do you create wealth? All three Ws would have been balanced in a Dr. Manmohan Singh government's budget.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chidambaram.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
One of the key messages in the interview with Mr. Chidambaram is about his remark that it's a capitalist budget. He says regulated capitalism creates more wealth to be shared with people, but his worry is that there's very little for the poor in this budget. He also argues that India needs job-creating investments. Now to the lighter stuff. In our pre-budget episodes, we discussed the poetic moments in a finance minister's speech. If Manmohan Singh introduced verses in a budget speech, others followed the practice with grace. Let's see how well Nirmala Sitharaman has scored on the literary front as she presented her fourth budget. Let's rewind.
Well, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman didn't really recite anything this time, unlike in her earlier budgets. She only referred to a Mahabharata verse and briefly explained the meaning and the context. That may have helped her make this one of the shortest budget speeches in the recent past. As she started part B of her speech, Sitharaman thanked the taxpayers for strengthening the hands of the government in helping fellow citizens in this hour of need. She summarized lines from the Mahabharat's Shanti Parva Adhyay to say the king must make arrangements for the Yogakshema, the welfare of the populace, by way of abandoning any laxity and by governing the state in line with dharma, along with collecting taxes which are in consonance with the dharma. Last year, Sitharaman's literary inspiration had not been from the ancient texts, but from a more recent poet, Rabindranath Tagore, and the poetry in the 2021-22 budget was not in the context of taxes, but against the backdrop of the pandemic. She had said, and I quote, "Now, just as it had happened after the two world wars, there are signs that the political, economic, and strategic relations in the post-COVID world are changing. This moment in history is the dawn of a new era." Quoting Tagore, she had said, "Faith is the bird that feels the light and sings when the dawn is still dark." Her first budget in July 2019, after the Bharatiya Janata Party returned to power for her second term, Sitharaman had opted for Chanakya Niti Sutra and Urdu couplet to capture the spirit of the party's victory and the mega programs of the Modi government. The crux of the verses was, "With determined human efforts, the task will surely be completed." In her second budget speech in 2020-21, Sitharaman had recited a Kashmiri verse from a poem by Pandit Dinanath Kaul. This was with reference to the government's efforts on ease of living. The translation of the verse meant, "Everything that we do, all of us do, is for this beautiful country."
Indeed, budget gets a sense of time and context with verses, whether it's from the epics or modern poets. That's all for today. Bye for now. See you on Tuesday with more news and views on budget.
If you like this video, share it and subscribe to Business Standard. For more news, views and insights, log on to www.business-standard.com. Do also follow us on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Telegram and LinkedIn.